Welcome to Computational Journalism. I'm going to just very briefly tell you who's up here because we're late in starting. And start with Sarah Cohen at the far end, who is now at Duke University, formerly of the Washington Post, where she won a Pulitzer Prize in investigative reporting. We have Matt Waite, who is the first, who created PolitiFact, the first website to win a Pulitzer Prize. And he's now at the University of Nebraska. And then we have Rich Gordon, who created the new media program, launched it at Medill University, and is a resident expert in online communities. I'm going to turn it over to them. They're experienced panelists. As Matt says, his job now is panelist. His job title, panelist. I'm actually going to step down there because they're good at running it themselves, and I'll intervene only if you guys get in a fist fight. Could happen.
It could happen.
It could happen, especially at the end.
Oh.
Matt and I are going to arm wrestle.
I'm going to get down to
Fisticuffs.
Yeah. I wanted to talk a little bit about, I'm going to start out with the idea of computational journalism, and I think it's one of those words or phrases that means many things to many people. And I sometimes have said that, when people talk about data journalism as a kind of offshoot of this, that data doesn't really mean anything and journalism doesn't really mean anything. So when you put it together, it means anything you want it to mean. And it's the same idea here. But I'm going to take one little precinct of what some people are calling computational journalism, and it's the precinct that sometimes has been left behind, and that is applying new methods and new techniques to reporting, as opposed to many of the other things that could be done. And I think journalism has always been slow to adapt things from other disciplines, and that's for a good reason. It takes a long time to perfect new methods and new techniques. And when you're trying to put stories out or trying to actually produce something out of them, you don't really want to be the first one to invent a new method to prove, say, cancer clusters. And it would be nice if the epidemiologists had figured that out on their own first. So, it's kind of not really appropriate for us in a lot of ways to start thinking about creating brand new methods on our own. So we were slow. We started on social science methods in journalism 50 years after the statisticians did. Computer-assisted reporting didn't take quite as long to develop, maybe only 10 or 15 years after the rest of the world. And I think that at this point we are catching up a little bit quicker. We may only be 3 to 5 years behind what other people are doing. And I'm not sure that that's a bad idea. I think most trades and most professions and most trades pick up things from the disciplines, from computer science, from history, from political science a little bit later. I come from, you may have noticed I come from Duke University, where I hold the Knight Chair there, and you may have thought to yourself, I never heard of Duke University's journalism school, and the reason is there is no journalism school at Duke University, and there's not really even a journalism program. I teach in a public policy school. And so I'm coming at this subject from the perspective of a public policy school, one that is quite naturally worried about journalism in its place in democratic society, kind of the big think of journalism and the big think of public affairs reporting. And the focus that we're working on is what some economists call the classic market failure of public affairs investigative watchdog reporting, and that is that it's an incredibly valuable public good, but not so much in the market. That a consumer won't pay a whole lot to read your investigative report, and a consumer would pay a lot to get advice on which car to buy, or might pay a lot to get entertained, but they're not going to pay a whole lot to become a better voter, and that's the economic theory behind it. So one of the things that I work on is how can we borrow techniques and methods from other disciplines in order to make public affairs reporting a little more efficient, a little less difficult, and at least a little bit more modern. And now I can actually go to the PowerPoint if I could figure out. I'm a software gal, so I think I can handle this one. So I work at the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy, so that's going to be where we come out of it. And what we're going to talk a little bit about is journalism research and research into reporting methods without a J school. And that does sound a bit weird, but we'll see if we can get it on. One of the things that I've been working on is something called the Reporters Lab, which we expect to launch actually in January. It'll have reviews and advice on reporting tools. It'll have document and data samples, challenges for researchers who want to work on journalism problems, and a whole wealth of information about reporting on public affairs reporting. And it's evolving, but it's focused on accountability and investigative reporting and adapting methods and tools. And the big thing about it is it's completely content neutral. We don't plan to be producing any stories ourselves, just making stories better. We'll probably end up working in newsrooms, though, at some point. One of the things that I wanted to talk a little bit about is how to reach out to other disciplines. We've been talking a lot in this conference about how we can learn from one another, how we can start reaching out. And one of the things that I've been working on a lot over the last 2 years is really reaching out to the more traditional disciplines. As an example, I've spoken at the conference called Viz Week, which is a conference of about 1,000 computer science experts who work on visualization and visualization theory. Another one that I've been starting to get involved in that's fairly active in this area is called That Camp, and it's a digital humanities unconference that goes on around the country. And I want to talk a little about what some of these disciplines are doing. I'll be giving a talk next week. There's a speech recognition lab at Carnegie Mellon University, and if you think about it, many of our records in reporting are now only available in audio and video form. And working with those as a reporter is really hard. And we can talk a little bit more about what kinds of things that they can offer us, but Carnegie Mellon is extremely interested in working with journalists and figuring out how to apply some of what they've been doing for defense and national security into the journalism area. And the last one, there's another digital humanities conference that we've started getting interested in, which is called Digging into Data. And I found it fascinating. They were working on, I think, 300 years of Old Bailey court records and trying to find trends in that. And some of the historians are learning how to mine text in a way that, obviously has obvious corollaries to journalism. And social scientists, this is Gary King from Harvard's Institute for Quantitative Social Science. And what's really interesting about that group is that what they have started to do is move away from the traditional social science methods of studying political science and into what we would consider much closer to reporting. And his point is that the only reason they used survey research and all of those social science methods was that they couldn't look at everything. Now that they can get everything, they need to come up with new methods to be able to work with it. So some social scientists are starting to move much closer to what we would consider reporting than others. Working with those disciplines, what I've been finding over the last year or two is that they are really very worried about what's happening to journalism. And they're very interested in working with reporters. One of the things that we find also is that we don't realize how much we have to offer them. I've learned that in those disciplines, documents are coin of the realm. That if you can provide them a storehouse of documents with stories that you already know that they produced, they can see if they can replicate it, and that's really valuable to them. So we can work with them, but these are all academics who are looking at their local news organizations and saying, wow, this is a problem, and they care a lot. And I think that that's one way that we can start thinking not just about looking inside our own institutions, but looking across all of the disciplines that might have something to do with journalism and might have something to do with reporting. Another way that we can start looking at working with other groups is to start writing for peer-reviewed journals in their field and in our fields. I was just a co-author in the communications of the ACM, which is the, Association of Computing Machinery or something like that. And it's a piece on computational journalism that really talks about how journalists and computer scientists can work together to further democracy, really. One of the other things that we're really interested in doing is creating tools not for publishing as much as for reporting. So that's another way that those of us outside a traditional journalism organization can use research and some of the advantages that we have inside academia to start making reporting a little bit more efficient and a little bit less difficult. Last year we created a product called TimeFlow, which is a timeline and chronology tool specifically for reporting to help you deal with these long-running court cases or anything that goes on for a really long time. One of the things we're working on right now is one of the complaints that we hear a lot from local reporters in particular is that you have to go to a school board meeting or a county council meeting or something like it, and you have to live tweet it. Well, that means you can't really take notes. It's really hard to do both at once, and they serve different purposes. So if you're doing a good job tweeting and live blogging, you're probably not taking very good notes. And so one of the things we're working on right now, it's not even at beta yet, but it's a working model, but it's just a working model, is how to use your own tweet stream or anybody's tweet stream as a navigational aid for video and audio. So you can pull up the audio or video of the legislature and use your tweet stream, search your tweet stream, or search your notes, or search anything, and have it take you to that approximate point in the audio and video to help you get back to some note-taking that you can't do on its own. One of the other things that I'm really interested in working on is because we've learned so much that other people care about journalism, and I think the open government community and the open government movement is one manifestation of that, is that we need to give them something that they can do, something concrete with possibly some reward. I know in our industry we don't really think of actually paying people to do things, but it's a good idea to offer a bit of a reward. So one of the things that we're working on is creating challenges that, say that, for instance, we need something that will help us manage the river of RSS feeds. And if we give them really good examples of the problems that people face, we'll pay a bounty if you can help solve that with a tool. So that's one of the reasons that having the storehouse of documents is so interesting. One of the ones, this is one that we're starting to look at how to work with legislative session audio. And anybody who's been covering courts in the last 5 years or so knows that it's very difficult to get court transcripts now. You have to work off of the audio. And so working with speech recognition, this is one reason to work with Carnegie Mellon, speech recognition is probably going to become a really important set of technologies for reporting. And another area that we're finding has a lot of corollaries in other fields are what I would call messy records, handwritten forms. There's one challenge that's out there for computationalists that deals with 2 million handwritten forms from World War I, where they're trying to get people, they get a contest for who can get those into a database through handwriting recognition and things like that. And obviously, if we can start tapping into some of that energy on some of those challenges, I think that we can solve a lot of, or not solve, but help a lot of the problems that we have now. This is just an example of one where I tried to work on it last year, where Mark Benjamin was doing a lot of work on Arlington Cemetery when he was at Salon. And he had a list of all of the people who were supposed to be in each grave in Arlington Cemetery. And it was this very nicely written, handwritten list. And these historical documents can end up being really interesting to work on. And it turned out it wasn't that hard to do really basic handwriting recognition on this and turn it from a list by alphabet to a list by grave. And that's all he needed was to be able to do it, was to be able to walk the cemetery by grave. Unfortunately, he had to do it before I figured out how to do this, so it kind of didn't ever make it into the story, but it was a really interesting example of the kinds of documents and the kinds of challenges that we face that other people face. And obviously, the police record, dealing with a big pile of police records is always a difficult task, and that's another kind of thing that we can do. And we've been talking with some computer science departments around the country, Stanford and also Carnegie Mellon, about how we can set up some kind of templating system for something like this. One of the other things what we can do outside of journalism school that possibly is more difficult to do inside a journalism school is start working with some of the associations, the Association of Police Chiefs, and start saying, here is how most of the systems in police departments are run. every local reporter is going to want your incident reports. How do we get it so that you guys are creating something that's easy to extract for us? And working with them so that when you write a note to your local police department saying, I want your incident reports, they don't say, gosh, nobody knows how to extract that from the system, which has been going on for now 2 generations, I believe. So those are kind of the kinds of things that we've been working on at Duke, kind of outside the element of journalism education. And again, it's just one little piece of this computational journalism idea, but it's we think that it's one that kind of fits in with the bigger issue of how we start taking newer methods and stop being 50 or 30 or 20 years behind and maybe only be 5 to 10 years behind. So.
Yes, right.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. So Matt, Waite, and I are going to tag team this a little bit and hopefully come up with some areas where we might actually even disagree and have some fireworks and et cetera. So I'm here, I guess, to try to start by sort of both broadening out a little bit from what Sarah talked about to at least an idea of what is computational journalism, and then talk about some things that we have done at Northwestern since I've been there in the past 11 years, unbelievably, that sort of fall into the space and maybe some lessons learned that might be helpful to those of you who are trying to do things in this space. So first off, I'm going to confess that I have several slides here that have way more words than I'm breaking all the rules for good PowerPoint presentations. And the main reason I'm doing it is because I know people might download it later and you might actually want the full text. So I'm not going to read everything on these slides, so don't be intimidated. But, I think we have to, it's probably, the idea of computational journalism is new enough that it probably doesn't hurt to try to define our terms. And so, as near as I can tell, my friend Irfan Essa, who teaches computer science at Georgia Tech, came up with the term, or at least popularized it for a conference that he put on, in a class and then a conference he put on. And he basically talks about a definition that is how computation is affecting all aspects of journalism, from news gathering to distribution, editing, commenting, etc. There have been a couple other people who've offered definitions, including Jay Hamilton, who works with Sarah at Duke. In his definition really focuses on what he calls the accountability function of journalism as sort of the area. And then Jonathan Stray, my friend Jonathan Stray, who now works at the AP and is one of the original, journo programmers, in that he has a degree in computer science and now finds himself working in journalism. He sort of broadens it back out again to talk about the application of computer science to the problems of public information, knowledge, and belief by practitioners who see their mission as outside of both commerce and government. And one of the things I find really interesting about this definition is he's actually trying to define journalism here. One of the aha moments I had in trying to think about computational journalism is that it's actually easier to define computational than it is journalism. And many of the problems, and as I've thought beyond computational journalism, I realize actually that a lot of the sort of arguments we get into, both within the profession and with those in other professions, you hear people say, well, that's not journalism, or that's not good journalism. Or you'll say, well, that is journalism. You will hear Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, will talk very, I realize actually that a lot of the sort of arguments we get into, both within the profession and with those in other professions, you hear people say, well, that's not journalism, or that's not good journalism. Or you'll say, well, that is journalism. You will hear Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, will talk very eloquently about the importance of journalism and how he wants Google to be a force for good in journalism, but he's actually really only talking about reporting. And reporting is only one piece of journalism, I think. So with all of this as input, I actually tried last year to put together a definition of computational journalism that I thought worked. And this is one of those slides I'm not going to read every slide of. But I want to just highlight a couple things here. I'm going to argue that for our purposes, certainly those of us in this room, we should be defining journalism very broadly. It's not just about reporting. It's not just about storytelling. It's every piece in the chain that starts with the recognition by a anybody that there's a topic or piece of information that someone needs to know about. In journalism, we call that the story idea. But it doesn't have to be just thought of as a story idea. It's just there's a nugget of information people need, and I recognize it. And starting there all the way through the development of the story, the creation of the story, the publishing of the story, the distribution of the story, the interacting with the audience after the story has been distributed, to me, that's all journalism. And I'm even going to go out on a limb and say, you know what? It's even journalism if we're thinking about how do we make money by doing all this, which is a little more controversial proposition. But I think, at the end of the day, one of the things one of the great joys of coming into academia is the opportunity to sort of think and read and learn more. And, I've discovered things like William Randolph Hearst in his time was called a journalist. And it was because he produced a journal. In fact, it was the journal. And in those days, when we look back on him later, we called him a publisher. We might have called him some other things as well. But the point is, I think journalism can encompass all those things. And certainly if we're thinking about how do we apply computation to journalism, I think we're wise to think about all of those things because they really are connected to one another. To me, what makes journalism is not sort of, is it reporting or is it writing? It is, what is the content that we're producing about? And that's the second bold-faced area, which is ways that engage users, consumers, and motivate them to be informed about and to participate in the public sphere. That, to me, is what starts to get closer to defining journalism. And by the way, if you've got a good definition, I'll welcome it. I haven't found one yet. But to me, it's as soon as we start, there's lots of information out there. What makes it journalism information is when it ties in some way to the public sphere and people's need to be informed about that. And then in general, it draws on both sort of a legacy of journalism and it draws on technical aspects of computer science. And that's sort of my working definition. Now, what have we done at Medill? We've done a whole bunch of different things in this space, and we've done most of these things because when I came to Medill 11 years ago, I had been the first online director for the Miami Herald, and I had hired developers, and I had realized that the thing that really differentiated a website from a newspaper was that people went to that site to do something, not just read or view the information. And as soon as they are doing something on the site, there's software behind it. And as soon as there's software behind it, you have to have developers. And I think we've all learned by now that publishing on the web is not just another page. We're not just putting another page out there for people to read and consume. We're creating an environment in which people interact with the content, with each other, with the staff of the organization. And all of these things ultimately require software, which means developers are involved. So from sort of very early, I decided I was going to try to create sort of a mini programming for journalists class that I tucked into a capstone class for people. I don't know, it might have had some impact, but it certainly wasn't transformative. And I actually started with my experience doing computer-assisted reporting work. I started by showing them spreadsheets and records and fields, and then moving them from there to actually creating a web page that had those data lines in them and manipulating the page in terms of how it worked. I would say it was not entirely successful. For as long as I've been at Medill, I have suggested to every freshman advisee I get, go to take a computer science course. And I would say, the reactions, have been historically, no, I'm scared to death of that idea. A few people have actually gone and done it and not been very happy with the experience, and I will talk maybe a little more about why they might have been happy with the experience, to a few people who did it and sort of the light bulb went off and they were excited. But I'd say just encourage them to take courses in another department. Did not work, and I would suggest probably will not work for most of us. We actually found a junior computer science faculty member who was really interested in media. We gave him a joint appointment in Medill and computer science. That didn't really work either for us or him. I think, to be honest, in hindsight, that his colleagues over there saw that he was not progressing toward tenure in his discipline and hoped that by adding this other ingredient, he would both light a fire under him and get him more in doing work that might get attention, and it didn't really work. But it was an interesting idea, and he certainly made some valuable contributions to the education of our students in journalism. What has worked, and we'll talk several levels about this. My colleague Emily Withrow, who came to us as an adjunct and came to us as an adjunct, was assigned to create the class that I think we would have called at the time our Flash class. And I suspect many of you have a Flash class in your curricula. In Flash, you can do pretty much everything. You can do a lot of cool things with the timeline and the stage and never get into the action script that underlies it all. And that was typically the way that class was taught. And she came in and said, no, you know what? That's not what I want them to learn. I want them actually to learn the action script. And she basically converted the course to being an introductory course in programming using action script. She applied to be a full-time faculty member. I went and visited her class, and I was just blown away by how successfully she had gotten a bunch of students who clearly had no intention or desire to learn computer programming to be learning how to do it. And I'll show you a little bit of a glimpse of how she did that, and Matt and I will do some back and forth on it as well. The second thing that has worked is, we actually got a grant to enable us to bring computer programmers to get a master's degree at Medill. And that has had enormous impact outside of Medill, and that several of these folks have gone out and done really remarkable work, especially on the Chicago Tribune News Applications team, where not only have they helped the Tribune, but they have actually set a standard and started to build a community of journo programmers, and they release a ton of code that lots of people share and use and build on. And that alone has been sort of probably the most single impactful thing we've done beyond the campus. Since 2009, we, with the collaboration of a couple of my colleagues in computer science, have offered joint classes where we bring together relatively equal numbers of journalism students and computer science students. We have them work in cross-functional teams, and we basically give them what we think is an interesting problem to solve. This has actually worked really well on a million levels. It's actually a relatively low investment of time and commitment on the part of the faculty because we're not largely developing a curriculum. We're not largely grading papers or assignments. We're just sort of facilitating their learning in their individual teams and helping them learn to talk to each other, frankly, because they have to learn a different vocabulary on each side just to make that collaboration work. We've also had a pretty good success with finding a couple of PhD students in computer science who've been interested in coming, who actually want to teach when they get out. Not just do research and not go to a startup. They actually love teaching. And frankly, in many computer science programs, there's no place for people who love teaching. Or it's hard to find a place in computer science academia where you're valued for your teaching. And so they really have appreciated the opportunity to come into our school, which is very teaching oriented, and work on teaching our students how to do interesting things with computer science. And the class that's currently being taught is essentially a class on JavaScript and APIs, and it's working very well, and the students are getting a lot out of it, and the junior, PhD students and PhD in computer science are getting a lot out of it. Couple of lessons learned, I think, lessons learned. Generally, computer science courses don't work for journalism students, okay? I'll talk a little more about the problem, but ultimately, most of us, when we are learning, want the applications and the examples that are used to be relevant to us. And that almost never happens in an introductory computer science course. That said, I think it is absolutely possible to embed the teaching of introductory programming principles in a journalism course and not call it programming. And so that is exactly what Emily is doing in our interactive news class. It's exactly, I think, where we're going with our database journalism class or classes, which sort of come from the roots of computer-assisted reporting, which is where Sarah and I and Matt have our roots. I would also say that it is absolutely, I'm going to say it's as important that we think not only about teaching programming to journalists, but let's figure out how to teach journalism to programmers. I think if we want to save journalism, or we want to sort of have an impact beyond our campuses, the goal is to turn out people who are bilingual in technology and journalism. And important points here. Bilingual, I love the metaphor of bilingual, because the reality is, if I'm in a foreign country and don't speak the language, I can go pretty far just with a phrase book, right? And it can help me a lot, just get me through. Clearly, it's better if I can actually speak the other language fluently, but anywhere in between is a step in the right direction. And I think that's what we should be trying to do. It means we don't have to try to turn our journalists into programmers as a goal. If they understand something about programming, we win. And we all know that programmer developers are going to go out there and invent the future. They already are. They've invented Facebook, and they're inventing Google, and they're, et cetera. So let's darn well make sure that we find some opportunities to teach them some things about journalism, so they go out and invent these things, invent things that are, help us with our mission and what we do. I talked about these interdisciplinary classes. To be honest, for the most part, we're teaching these classes as overloads, but it's not bad because really we come into class once a week. We let each student team talk about what they've done the past week, and the rule essentially is every week you have to have something to demo. And we give them feedback and they come back a week later. So it's a relatively low impact, low cost, low time investment for a lot of value return both for us and for the students. Here's just a few examples of projects students worked on. We gave the students a challenge, which was people are increasingly always connected with a mobile device of some kind, and they have time-limited opportunities to use something, to consume news. They may have literally 15 seconds. They may have 5 minutes. They may have 15 minutes. Can we create an application that actually gives it to them in different time lengths rather than different topics, rather than different other ways of slicing up the news? And so the team not only came up with sort of technology that starts to do that, but came up with a very cool concept to name it. They called it News Feed. And you have the 5-minute snack, the 10-minute fast food, and the 20-minute full meal. And whichever one you choose, you get a package that gives you just that news in just those configurations. Pretty interesting idea, and one that could not probably have been built without the involvement of both journalism students and computer science students. Journalism students thinking about the audience and sort of the use case, and computer science students actually being able to build it. Twitter publishing, this is 2 years ago when this is from our sort of very first full-scale collaborative class. It's from 2 years ago. At the time, Twitter was really just getting started, but the basic idea was if you tweet something about a news story, can you instantly, from a publisher, get back the relevant link? And this actually was built so that it would work. And the example you see here is somebody says, I heard an Air France plane got caught in a storm over the Atlantic Ocean, and they were on a status. They actually built something that read the content of that, saw Air France, and in the hypothetical publisher we were working with would have generated the story back immediately based on that. And that's all doable, fundamentally today and 2 years ago. Another example, and this one actually turned into a startup company, and it's actually not the one that I'm proudest to have on my resume, or proudest to say I was part of. This was a case where the story we said is, can you make stories from data? And the students came up with, well, let's start with sports because there's a lot of data around sports, and then let's start with baseball because in sports most data is around baseball. And they generated a story that would, from the box score and play-by-play, generate a story about the game. And this piece of software, which is now commercialized under a company called Narrative Science, actually is, there's a business there, and it's basically generating a story from data. Most of the stories they're generating are business stories, earnings reports, local economic reports, et cetera, from data on the business. But they also have a very interesting application where essentially if you are using the most popular iPhone app for keeping the game score of your kid's Little League game, it will generate a story about every Little League game. It is also the most prolific author of stories about Big Ten women's softball, which otherwise is not written about at all. So it's a very interesting project, and sort of a home run in terms of being a real application. Truthfully, this was not the most pressing problem in journalism that I thought needed to be solved, but when you sort of put people together, put journalism students and computer science students together, you never know what you're going to come up with, and I think in a lot of ways it's testimony to the value of doing that. Now, the one thing I would say is it sure would help if students in both of these disciplines before coming to this class had actually learned something about the other discipline. We basically have skipped over that step, and it creates no end of communication and other challenges for us and for them. And so I think that's probably where we want to go next, is to start thinking about, what does the computer science student need to know about journalism to be successful in this class? What does the journalism student needs to know about computer science to be successful in this class. And I think that will get us make these classes even more successful. The other lessons learned, I think we've had an interesting byplay by email over the past couple of weeks. We've talked about this. In general, my idea about interdisciplinary teaching or teaching of stuff that is sort of foreign to your discipline is you have to start by meeting the students where they are in their heads and understand where they're coming from, and find ways to make what we're teaching relevant to them. And that's true of all classes, I think. It happens that most journalism students, where they are when it comes to computer science, is they have little or no prior programming experience, and there is this almost, in some senses, badge of pride among some of them that I'm not good with computers, or I'm not good with math, or I'm not good with data, and we can fret about it, but it is the reality for many of the students that we have. And so the key there, and here I'm sort of learning from my colleague Emily Withrow, is how do we find ways, and this is a big challenge in a computer science introductory course, find ways that you can immediately show them they will see something relevant and valuable to them quickly in this class. In other words, they don't want to spend all quarter learning to write a long computer program and not see some kind of return on that investment of time. So here's what Emily does in her first first class lecture, before she even gets into teaching anything. She says, here's some great examples of journalism online, and I want to show this to you. This is the Slate Middle East Buddy List, and she says, by the end of week 1, you actually would be able to do this, to do the programming that underlies this, because it's really very simple JavaScript kind of stuff. Then she shows this application that is essentially a budgeting game, and says, you know what, you will have the programming skills to do this by week 5. And then she says, here's an interactive graphic that The Guardian has, and you'll be able to do the programming behind this by week 8. And that gets them really excited about what's possible, because it's tying the example together with the here's what you can expect if you stay in this class. Okay, so this is another one of those slides I'm not going to read, and then I'm going to turn it over to Matt. But that's my friend and colleague Emily Withrow on the right. One of the things that I think works for her, by the way, is that she's a young female teacher who relates really well to our 70% female young student body, and can relate to them in a language they can understand. And frankly, I have to get over a hurdle if I do that, because I'm an older guy, and so I think that definitely helps her. But what really helps her is that she ties together sort of why you need to learn this and why you want to learn it, with the real applications of things that they would say, oh yeah, I'd like to be able to do that because it's relevant to me as a journalist. So I'm going to get out of this now and let Matt come up and give us his side, and then I'll come back.
I still carry around new guy status at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, NE the Harvard of the Plains. I just got my business cards not that long ago, which, other than the paycheck, I thought that made me official. So I'm still in that first semester of teaching, oh my God, what did I get myself into? Help me, help me, help me mode. So a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about is actually born of abject failure, but I think that's actually a positive because it means I'm learning. So I teach a class at Nebraska called Developing New Media, which is a name that I have hated and fought and throw up in my mouth a little bit every time I have to say it out loud. So if you don't mind, last time I'm going to talk about it, where I teach product development as an act of journalism. My kind of awakening of this was building PolitiFact, where I had grown up believing that I was going to die at my desk, a reporter, that I was going to be cremated and put into the morning edition, and that was it. That was going to be my life. That's all I ever wanted to do. I was on the investigative staff at the St. Petersburg Times. I was doing computer-assisted reporting. I was doing computer-assisted reporting. It was beyond what a lot of people were doing, like learning satellite imagery analysis so I could look at the loss of wetlands in Florida during a time when the federal government was supposed to protect them. And just anytime some new tool came along, I could go use it. But I got kind of tired, and lo about the heady days of 2006, with roughly the Paleolithic era of the internet, I got this idea that, hey, I've got 300 gigs of public data on my hard drive. We should let our readers see that. So, bosses, can I go learn how to put data on the web? And I don't know if I caught them on a bad day or they were just weak or what. They said, yeah, sure, go ahead. So they gave me the greatest gift that a professional could ever be given, which is a desk without a phone. You disappear from the face of the earth at that point. So I was teaching myself how to do this, and I got a phone call from the Washington bureau chief who figured out my cell phone and called me that way. And he said, hey, I got this idea how we can cover presidential politics differently, and I don't have any idea how to do it. You got a few minutes? And the rest, they say, is history. I've never been back to being a reporter since then, amazingly enough. So throughout that process of building PolitiFact, and even after we launched it and we were launching other projects and we were doing all these things, I found myself saying over and over and over again, well, I didn't learn this in journalism school, and whew, we never talked about this in J school. And so when Nebraska asked me to teach this class first as an adjunct and now full time, I thought back to what I kept saying. Well, I didn't talk about this in journalism school, and I said, well, God damn it, I'm going to talk about it in journalism school. So I divide the class up into 3 parts: thinking, talking, and doing. And I'll lecture and we'll talk about various business models. We'll talk about advertising models on the web and what's working, what isn't, more to the point, what isn't. We'll talk about social, mobile. We cover a lot of ground in 16 weeks. And as part of this, I'm also teaching them how to program. They may not have realized this when they walked in the door, but too bad. I tell them day one, this class is going to be hard, and you're going to be confused and frustrated, and you're going to wonder why the hell you ever signed up for this. And then it's going to click. And the example I give them, how many of you have watched a European soccer match? So you're watching soccer, and the ball's moving around. It's going left, it's going right, and then it gets a little close to the goal, and then nothing happens. And then all of a sudden, after 20, 30, 40, 50, maybe 90 minutes of abject frustration, go! That's programming right there. God damn it, God damn it, God damn it, God. Good, it worked. And
It says hello world.
Yes. And I have students that do that. They laugh. They're like, oh, ha, 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 old man. Then in the middle of the semester, just in the class is kind of quiet and people are kind of banging away, and all of a sudden, it scares the hell out of everybody in the room. And it's great. And I'm like, I told you, it's soccer. So the idea is that they develop their own product to the prototype stage. I don't believe for a second that I can get a bunch of journalism students who have never programmed anything in their life to produce a fully functional product in 16 weeks. What I say is, build me a prototype. Show me a URL, show me a few pages, show me it working, show me your idea. Sketch it out. Honestly, I learned this lesson with PolitiFact in that we were talking to editors about it. Hey, we're going to do this thing. And they're like, yeah, sounds okay. Sounds kind of interesting. And when we built an actual functional demo, a prototype of it, whole conversation changed. Suddenly it went from to, oh, wait a minute. So we can do this and this and that, and if we move this thing over there, and it changed from should we do this to we can do it differently. We can do this, that, and the other thing. So the whole fundamental conversation just shifted with the unveiling of a prototype. So I'm trying to teach my students how to do that, and I teach them Python and Django. Why? Because I personally believe that Python is the most approachable language out there. It has an entire religious fervor around simplicity. That there is one, or there should be, and usually is, only one good way to do a thing. And if any of you have ever worked with another language like PHP or Perl or anything like that, you realize that one way to do a thing is an absolute revelation in the world. It's wonderful. So I have a hard enough time getting students through this. I don't want to have to say, well, you could do it that way, or this 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 way. Pick one, whatever you want to do. They're already overwhelmed. Overwhelmed to the point that I honestly tell them when we start out, I say, okay, this is the one time in this class I'm going to talk about your grade, and that's when we talk about the syllabus. I said, after this, you have an A. You have an A until you don't produce a prototype at the end. I don't want you to think about your grade the entire semester at all. This is real-world grading. When you get hired at a job, everybody's got an A. Your job, keep your A. So guess what? You got an A. And don't ask me about your grade again. If you ask me about your grade again, I'm going to throw you the hell out of class. I'm going to throw you the hell out of my office. Wherever we are, I'm going to yell at you. So worry about learning how to program. Learn about learning how to prototype. Learn about all of this stuff. Your grade is fine. If you show up, shut up, and do the work, you'll do fine. And God, if millennial students are unable to do this. But I try, all right? I'm trying. So the problem that I see, another thing that I do is I have a group of students at a special honors school for computer science and management, the Jeffrey L. Rake School for Computer Science and Management at the University of Nebraska, which is a collection of students who aren't all computer science. There are business majors, econ majors, sociology majors. You can be any major across the campus and be in this Rake School, this kind of honors college. And their capstone course is to be hired by a business in the area and build a product. And the College of Journalism hired the Rake School to build a web-based, it's essentially a web-based iPad app that will work both on desktop and iPad for a project that we have at the college where we send students around the globe to photograph people in poverty. We have another very generous benefactor who pays for those trips. Now we're taking this other thing and using it to feature that photography in a much more immersive environment. They are all technically inclined students, and they could not be any different from my students that I have in my class. And it can be described thusly. When my students are confronted with any reasonably technical challenge, they say, I can't do this. I can't. It's impossible. I'm not good at computers. And by the way, if any of you ever says I'm not good at computers out loud, I want you to get down and do 20 push-ups and say you're sorry. Because if we say that, our students believe that it's okay. And Rich said something before of this almost celebrated idea of I'm not good at computers. And I'm sitting there going, almost? Oh no. I mean, I'm not good at computers is the new I'm not good at math. And it always just pissed me off that in the newsroom, like, I'm not good at math. Hey, you're great. All right, buddy. No, you're celebrating ignorance. For an industry that celebrates being smart and clever, to then go out and celebrate being dumb is, well, dumb. So my journalism students are like, oh, I'm not good at computers. I can't do this. This is impossible. When I do the same thing with my Rake students, I say, okay, I need to get this thing done. And they say, okay. All right, do you know how to do that? No, but I'll get it done. It's not a big deal. They have this, and the word I use is swagger. They have this just confidence about them that any technological challenge is really just a matter of time and effort. That if they just sit down and figure out how to use whatever tech I'm telling them to use, then they'll figure it out. It's an inevitability. There is not the concept of I can't. It's I can't right now, but give me some time. And the thing that's blowing me away about these students is that I laid out three, we work in iterations and they're 2-week iterations. So we had enough iterations to get us through to the end of the year. And a week and a half later I came back and they're done with most of them. And I'm like, you know guys, I got to keep you all busy until January, so slow down. You're making me look bad here, people. So the more I started thinking about this divide between journalism students and technology students, the more I started to worry about it. And Rich said we shouldn't fret about it. I am fretting about it. I'm actually kind of freaking out about it, because if journalism needs smart technical people for this digital future, if we have an entire generation of students who say, I'm not good at computers, we're hosed. We're in deep trouble. So been thinking about this a lot, and I continue to think about it. And my answer is, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. Thank you all. Good night. No, not quite. The first thing is, we should assume that our journalism students have zero tech literacy at all. Done. Zip. Zero. I have been led to believe that this millennial generation is the most technologically advanced generation in history, and it is complete bullshit. They are users of a technology. They do not understand a technology. We have trained a bunch of people to swing a hammer. We have taught nobody carpentry. And it's bothersome to me. So I start out assuming that nobody in the room can spell HTML, let alone know what it is. So the next step, and this is where I have realized this semester in particular, where I have failed, and that is to teach computational thinking. That I believe a significant portion of the reticence that journalism students have towards some kind of digital problem is that they are unable to realize that big problems are just a series of small problems, and that if you attack them in some order and as small problems at a time, you'll eventually solve the big problem. So dividing up a task into much smaller tasks, dividing up a problem into much smaller problems, is not something that they have a real kind of instinctive sense to do, which is somewhat hilarious and wrong, in that this is what we do with reporting all the time. If I'm doing a big project about inner city crime, my first step is to start calling individuals and start asking them questions and build up to bigger questions and bigger problems and gather data and gather documents, and I am building towards solving the much bigger problem. But for whatever reason, journalism students have been able to map that same idea, that same reporting as building towards a large solution, to technology. And I freely admit I am failure number one here. And I've already started mapping out how I'm going to do that the next time I teach this class. The other place that I realize, and I'm hoping this is just Nebraska students, but I have a funny feeling it's not, is that even basic data literacy, I'm talking about structures and rows and columns and basic terminology, is also something that's just absolutely foreign to them. They've all used Excel. They have no kind of higher level understanding of what they're doing. To them, Excel is Word with columns. And it's horrible. We've just gone through the part of the process in programming Django of building data models, building the structures that are going to store data. And I have students who continue to create a model where, okay, so we're going to build a Django app that is going to rate every pizza in a college town, which would be hugely popular. I'll have students who I say, okay, you're building a model to store data on every pizza. Every pizza has common elements. They have a crust, they have toppings, they have who made it, and several other things. And their models that they come out and write are pepperoni, beef, and the fields that they're creating are all of the ingredients, and then all of the crust, then pan, hand-tossed, crispy, all this different stuff. And I'm like, no. You are making a representation of all of them. You will then put that data into it, and they stare at me like, huh? And finally, one of them, I said, okay, think of this as a spreadsheet. The model is your spreadsheet, and each row of it is the data that you're going to type in there. So you create a spreadsheet that says, okay, here's all the toppings, and then you'd put each row of toppings. And I could just see the barest flicker of the candle go off above his head, and I'm like, I think I'm starting to approach being able to explain this to you. And like I say, most of what I have done and learned here is born of abject failure. So I see myself struggling to explain something to somebody, and I realize, wait a minute, I need to rewind and make this like an entire lecture. Happy to entertain the argument that teaching full-blown programming to journalism students may not be the best, the highest and best use of some students, that some students just aren't going to do this, that they're just not inclined to be technical and they're not inclined to be programmers. Fine, I'm willing to have that argument with you. But I will also tell you that even if they don't, and I would say the majority of the kids that I've had won't, at least they now have a level of understanding that they didn't have before. One of my students may be the next big name great reporter, and they may write books and they may be on TV and they may be the most talented reporter and writer you've ever met in your life. But you can't tell me that there will never be a day in their journalism career that they will not be in a newsroom, in a meeting, where there will be a designer, a developer, a product manager, a web editor, a producer, all of these people sitting around going, okay, we're going to produce this product, this project, this idea that we have, and all of these people are going to come into play. That they took my class, that they have this understanding of programming and product development and prototyping and design and all that, sets them in a position to have a much better conversation in this regard. And I tell my students, someday you're going to be in a room with a developer, and that developer is going to start throwing a bunch of bull your way. And you're going to be able to say, nah, you are full of shit. And change the conversation. And that has value in and of itself. They may not ever be the next great programmer, but they're going to be on a team of people who are trying to execute an idea, and they're going to work with programmers. And the better they're able to communicate with them, the better off we will all be. Here's where Rich and I are going to have fisticuffs.
Actually, I suspect we're not, but Matt actually just wrote a really fine blog post on his blog about this I can't problem, and so I actually showed that to my colleague Emily Withrow and asked her to give her take on that. And so, by the way, I'm going to pass over this for now, but if any of you have the question of how do we find computer scientists who want to work with us, I have some ideas on that. Let me skip over that and go back to this. So, and as well as future directions.
By the way, if you want to read that post, it is at blog.mattwaite.com.
Let me go back to this before I bring up Emily. So, in terms of where we ought to be going, I have a couple thoughts, and then I'll come to Emily. So the first thing is, I think, going back to what I said before, how can we actually build programs that encourage journalism students to take CS courses and computer science students to take journalism courses? I think there are lots of ways we know how to do that. There are things like certificates and double majors and majors and minors. And I think even if you find only a few people who want to do that, sort of nurturing that interest and encouraging them to do it is a really good thing. The second thing I want to say, and this might be an area where we might have some fisticuffs. I had this sort of brainstorm at one point that said, we're so used to organizing our schools around media silos, broadcast, newspaper, magazine, online, and we know that those lines are blurring, but we haven't really fundamentally found a better way. And so we just pile more and more stuff on is essentially what happens, and we can't do it. So, I'm going to go with a different sort of radical idea, which says, let's actually help students figure out what kind of people they mostly are. Are they reporter-type people? are they storytelling type people? Not that you can really do one without the other in many cases, but which is really the area you're going to develop your biggest expertise? And storytelling, by the way, these days obviously has to be video, it has to be animation, and not every reporter wants to do that or can do that or will do it as well as somebody who is more storytelling focused, and vice versa. And then a third category, which I'm calling publishing or production. We used to call it editing. But sort of if we started with that as the way we organized our programs, I think we might get out of some of the boxes we're in terms of thinking about media silos, because you can do any of these three things on any platform or any technology. I think what differentiates people is which of those things are they most interested in doing, are they best at? And if we could sort of get to that, we'd be in an interesting place. And one of the reasons I like that idea is I actually can imagine a programming component for each of those categorizations. So, for instance, and this is barely thought through, but reporters really might need the tools to do screen scraping, to go get data off the web, and so they can dump it into the Excel. That's a teachable skill with Python in a reasonable amount of time. If you're storytelling, you might want, as with Emily's class, to use ActionScript or jQuery to build really simple interactive graphics. And that would be a good introductory course in that for you as a storyteller. And if you are in publishing, production, editing, and management, maybe it is actually getting under the hood of WordPress, for instance, and making the page look like something other than a blog, which, again, can be done with basic knowledge of PHP and HTML and CSS.
I will pick a fight with you on WordPress.
Okay.
I heard a really, I can't claim this as my own, but it's perfect. It's a perfect description of WordPress. WordPress is that pretty girl in the horror movie who pulls her face off and there's a bunch of like worms and stuff coming out of it. You don't want to go under the hood of WordPress. You really don't.
So
I would like just also to add, though, what you're suggesting is something that mirrors the organization of most newsrooms much more closely than the other silos that you were talking about.
Yeah. So I know where Matt's coming from on WordPress, and frankly, he's probably right. Although it is also hard to avoid the fact that 80% of media sites right now are running on WordPress.
Yeah,
if they're
that's
true. So you may have reason to want to know how to do it. So finally, with the I can't problem, and this is where again I brought Emily in. I highly encourage you to talk to her. She's I'm really happy to have her as a colleague on the faculty. So I already told you her first lesson, which is show them the examples first and inspire them that they'll be able to replicate these in a few weeks. She is also, and I think Matt and she are on the same page in sort of being forthcoming about the difficulty of this. And I think, you really can't say it too much that this is hard. We know this is hard. It's going to be hard for you to do this. She has a great line. I'm going to read this from an email she sent me. It says, in every project that you work on, every single one, you will need to do something that you have not done before. When it comes to programming, you will get error messages you have not seen before, and really, what programming is about is learning how to solve problems. And this is what I love. She says the code either works or it doesn't, and when it doesn't, everything falls apart. And here's what sucks: it's all your fault.
Yeah.
And that's a very different message, I think, than we send in other kinds of classes. And I think it actually, again, coming from her especially, it really comes across well. So because what she follows up is there's always a solution, right? And I will help you find it. And then once you have figured out how to solve it, I'm going to encourage you to be the expert in the class for other people in the class who have this problem. And she says, I expect my class to be kind of like group therapy sometimes. I want people commiserating over the problem that they're solving and looking to their peers for answers. And what she says is the learning curve gets a lot less steep. And once you've learned this, you can learn other programming languages as well. She urges us to stay away from computer science jargon. It's actually different than my approach. I like them to know the terms because of what Matt said about needing to talk to a developer who's going to use these terms. But I think what Emily's really saying is don't start there. Start with the ideas, introduce the jargon later. Now, to make it fun, I'm sorry to say I missed her doing this in class, but it sounds like the most fun in the world in a computer programming class. And I want her to get it on video, because what she does is to illustrate the idea of a do loop, a program that runs through a series of events and different things happen as a result of that. Let me just read you her description of this. It says, I actually get the students together in the room and I set up an assembly line. Someone is in charge of setting the initial value. Another one checks the condition, like is 4 less than 5? Yes, proceed. Someone else adds 1 to the iterator. A team then applies a series of actions to the object, and then someone dumps the object that they passed through this process into a bucket, which is the array. And it sounds really hokey, but they get the idea of how a software loop works. And I think it's a really brilliant idea, and I'm going to get her to do it on video because I think it's probably a concept that a lot of people
That's
have.
utterly brilliant. That's just
So I love that, and it's a great example. Another thing she says is never, ever, ever take over the keyboard for the student. Look over their shoulder, tell them, you might want to look here, but do not ever get there and type. It's their job to figure that out. Yeah. And you know what?
guilty.
I can't. That would drive me crazy. But I totally understand why, because I could do it so much faster if they just let me on the keyboard. But I totally understand why she's saying it, and I think it's a very good advice.
I'm probably going to have to wear boxing gloves to class.
And then finally, really this whole idea of, incremental things where each step along the way you get to claim score, even if it is just writing "Hello World." That doing that repetitively and building is clearly the way you're going to need to reward them. And I think Matt is sort of in the same space.
Yeah, I'm one thing I realizing that I'm guilty of is I don't have enough kind of
small wins.
Yeah, exactly. Small wins. I'm have them going towards an overarching goal, and there's a bunch of mileposts along the way. But thinking about like driving down a road that you've never been on before, but in the fog, so you're making progress, but you have no idea where you're going. So it isn't until the end when you see it that you emerge from the fog and go, oh, hey, that's what. Okay, now I get it.
Anyway, that's my last slide. I have no idea how much time we have left, so no time. Okay.
No time, but is there a way that people could ask you questions beyond this? Is there a way we could carry on a conversation? We actually will have
You certainly can carry it over at the reception afterwards. I'm happy to take email questions. I mean, I suppose we could set up a email loop at least or a discussion thing or something. I think this is an area that we all need. We all know, there's a bunch of things people in this room know that we don't know. So it would be an interesting idea to think about that.
terrific if you could figure out a way to carry on the conversation. I would like to hear more too.
Okay. All right. Good. Let's think about that. If you're interested in participating, come up here and jot down your email address or something,
Yes,
and
please.
we'll figure out how to do that.